Much for asking me to do this. When I chatted with Chris about this a couple weeks ago, some ideas just kind of came up as to themes that might be interesting. And as I'm hearing and as I read the draft of the summaries, it's obvious that there's so much commonality that is kind of tacit, I think, among many of the chapters. And as I was reading it, actually, I was thinking about what Chris and I were involved with in one case where in the Darfur peace building project that we had a meeting of civil society representatives and the kind of leadership or their associates of the militia groups in Sudan. And the focus of attention was exactly not only the tension between the two groups, but also their claim, the civil society representatives, for legitimacy to be heard in various venues, contexts, situations. It really was, and there were some representatives of women's groups, it really was a clear example of many, many examples of groups feeling disenfranchised by the militia groups that claim to be fighting on their behalf. These groups feel disenfranchised and a need for legitimacy. So in that example, and I think so many others, it seems so clear to me that the dominant model for reflecting on legitimacy is the model of the politics of identity and difference, that about which there's been only an enormous amount of research from multiple fields. So what I want to do is just throw out how legitimacy is interconnected to so many other ideas and processes and kinds of experience. In many cases, at least in the context of the politics of identity and difference. I think in some of and then we'll see how it fits. Okay, and obviously you're all going to be the judge of that. But my sense is that the model that as I'm extracting from bodies of literature fit very well in some cases. And maybe in others, well, I'm not sure. Maybe tweaking the model, or extending it or whatever, or changing it possibly. So I'm going to suggest, I'm going to start, which is that idea that legitimacy basically is a claim of a group to a claim to other groups to demand their respect or to be included, as it were, the right of inclusion, or to demand some kind of redress of injustice. There's so much focus on the past, the redress of injustice. So I'm concerned here, or my question here is, what are the preconditions for that claim? What has to be present in order to establish a claim, and I don't want to say legitimate, but a understandable claim of one group against another group? And there's a couple of, some of the examples I think are obvious, and one thing that I've come across, just an example, and then I'll go through kind of that more conceptual, is the claims of indigenous Indians in Venezuela. Of course, many indigenous people define themselves by the need to redress injustices of the past as well as the current suffering. And these are more than political. These are really focused on the politics of identity and difference. And again, it's always that claim to some other group, national legislature, or of course there's many other groups about which they're presenting this claim, proclaiming this. And I'm just going to read just a couple sentences from the director of the Commission on the Rights of Indigenous People in Venezuela from a few years ago. And she was rehearsing the suffering of the indigenous Indians in Venezuela. She was repeating it and then declaring, when we speak about a people, we refer to those who originally inhabited the region, to those who inhabit a territorial space, to those who have a common history, to those who speak their own language and now have a distinctive form of economic, social, and political organization. So this is her sense of a people. Do not deny us the right to be as a people. And it doesn't mean, sisters and brothers, a separation or fragmentation from the Venezuelan people. So it's both the existence of the people and the claim for recognition, or as it were, legitimacy. So what underlies this? So I'm going to suggest a couple of processes, social psychological processes, again, coming from enormous body of literature on identity and difference. So there's three processes. So first, in identity and difference, and this this is one very common theme, that each group has a sense of their distinctiveness. Each group, in each identity group, Indigenous peoples or people who feel disenfranchised, have a need to, actually any group, not just the disenfranchised, have a need to acquire a sense of their distinctiveness, their glory, their self-esteem, their distinctiveness. We see this all the time, you know, symbols of their achievements and their adoration of their gods or God if it's religious. And so that drive for distinctiveness, according to a lot of the research, is placed in contrast to an opposing drive for assimilation. That is, individuals need to be distinct, you know, and the group, but also need to live together. So we have these two kind of opposing drives that social psychologists have said is inherent in each person as a social self. So with that, you have a sense of a group, and again, I'm really speaking in very general terms now. A sense of a group is an imagined community. Benedict Anderson's, you know, well-known thesis on this, I think, is really important. So that is, when a group establishes this distinctiveness, it demands the power to have its own identity. That is, part of being distinct is ownership of the constructs that define themselves. And of course, there's an enormous range of constructs, you know, history, celebration, symbols of glory, defining narratives, and so on. So this is a power to own one's own identity. And I'm just going to mark that down here. So the first thing is the imagined community really constitutes a power to own one's own, sounds a little clunky in grammar, to the power to, as it were, create and manage one's own identity constructs. So to own and manage one's own constructs, basically to be in control of the stories that define themselves. So this could be represented just really simply, to oversimplify this, as the self, or in-group, basically has a projection or projects an image of itself. Self has an image of itself, obviously, ownership of its identity. But social researchers have also shown that that image of itself is always relational. That is, so when, in the case of indigenous people, the Indians of Venezuela, it's always relational to the other. It's as if the other has kind of a shadow existence. Sometimes it's explicit in the narratives. And this is common for the formation of lots of nations, of groups, in the transformation of ethnic societies. So in a certain sense, the ownership of the self also, of self-identity, also has a projection of the presence of the other. So the ownership of the self carries with it the presence of the other. So identities, in other words, identities are always relational. Okay? So this is the imagined, this is just a oversimplified kind of coarse-grained account of a process in identity construction. Okay? Now, what also happens in social identity is a very different process. And that is that the group senses that other groups are defining who they are. That other groups, especially high-powered groups, basically have an ideology. I mean, this is so rampant in societies, that the high-powered group defines itself through a general ideology that defines the subgroups. And in some cases, it may be innocuous, but in many cases, it's pernicious. But it's always ideological. So in this case, the other, this is the imagining of the other. The other, that is, the outgroup, has an image of the in-group. So the outgroup has an image of the in-group, obviously projecting, defining, limiting. I just saw this in the paper the other day. Did you see where the Minister of Registry in Virginia, he was defining all Virginians as black and white, which meant, according to this Native American, there were no Native Americans. So in the designation of every citizen in Virginia, there were literally no Native Americans. You know, such an obvious example of Galton's structural violence, in that case, identity violence. So here you have the other defining the in-group in many, many processes. And let me just stress, there's lots of processes going on here and here that I could talk about, but I'm just giving a coarse-grained gloss over it. And there's lots of processes here. The example I just gave, there's processes of religious ideology defining subgroups and so on. And that in turn has an impact on the self, understanding of itself. So in other words, the other is defining the high power group, if you want to call this high power group, is common. High power group will invariably define the low power group. And that in turn infiltrates the sense of who they think they are. So this happens in colonial experiences very often. The Belgians defining Hutus and Tutsis, one is high power, low power. The English with the different caste system in India and so on. Many, many groups. And in many cases, it will infiltrate. The group takes it on. They then are, as it were, infiltrated, almost contaminated, looking at it from, from our perspective. So that's a process that basically is very different from this process. This is losing ownership, obviously, of identity. So what happens with identity politics? Is you have basically a tension between these two processes. So the tension between these two processes, this is the process of contentious politics of identity and difference. It is the issue of power over the constructs that define a group. What is the power that defines the group? So it's the debate. It becomes, of course, a major topic of concern with ethnic-based conflicts, with racial-based conflicts, with all these conflicts. The question is who defines the group, and obviously this becomes a major topic in rebellion. That the group, the low power group, of course, will reject the defining limitations of that group that's defined by the high power ideology. That is, the dominant group obviously has the ideology that in rebellion the low power group rejects, then obviously offers different constructs for self-esteem, and so on. So this is a very common process. So the model of contentious politics is basically underpins the debate about legitimacy. The debate, the tension, the contention, in some cases the struggle, in some cases the conflict, the debate about legitimacy of the self in relation to the other. It's a contest, it's a controversy, and it's a struggle over who has ownership of of those constructs. So that's where I see the issues of legitimacy, of the right of inclusion, related to that, of the demand for human rights respect, recognition of a certain place at the table, as it were, sometimes literally, but often metaphorically, just a sense of what is due. And so there are so many processes, there's so many episodes and examples of this, which I think I read in some of your summaries that some of them fit exactly like this. Now, of course, there's a reaction by the high power group. Of course, this is the struggle. The high power group claims that they're threatening society, that the whole stability of the country is at risk, and so on. So that's where the focus of the... So legitimacy could also be a question of the high power group. Sometimes in the threat narratives, the high power group will say, oh, well, this group, they claim to be just helping themselves, but really they're destroying the foundation of society. We saw this with the issue of gays trying to be married. The conservatives said, you're destroying the foundation of marriage in America. And this is the common threat language that we hear when low power groups rise up. So legitimacy and related terms can also make sense from the perspective of the high power group. And of course, that's where a lot of the contention arises. So if that is reasonable, that is, again, I'm suggesting this model that's very common in identity politics, and whether it applies in your cases, I think it does. I suspect it does in many cases. Maybe it needs to be tweaked. But then staying with the model. So what exactly is this process? Or what are the underlying process? Well, clearly, if we go, continue with this, there are two processes or central concepts at work here. One is power, and the other is injustice. These are, as it were, the major dominant, not just concepts, but their whole processes. It's not just a single variable that can be tested. These are very complex processes, as you know. Now, I'm struck by the asymmetry of attention here. There's an enormous amount been written in many fields about power dynamics, and we, in our field, I think, really draw upon and invoke the work of certain people, Galtung and all the founding figures and major figures in our field who talk about this. this idea of the process of the sense of injustice is given scant attention except in examples. There are just every example that I've ever seen of an identity-based conflict centers on this, the sense of injustice. I have not come across one case where the sense of injustice by the disenfranchised group is irrelevant. Injustice, unfairness, inequality, rights abused, so on. Some sense of injustice. And of course, some people have written about this, Morton Deutsch and some others have written about this, but there's little depth to this. There's very little, in my opinion, depth in understanding what this is. So let me just suggest.
Does that vary from the grievance literature? I mean, are you understanding injustice differently than how people are writing about grievance? Are those equivalent concepts?
So grievance within, give me an example.
So I guess as I'm thinking about it, injustice is a sense is I in my mind I'm equating injustice and grievance in the sense that the group is coming forward and saying, here's my listing of grievances that are representative of the injustice that is being done to me.
So that's right. Okay, so that makes sense. So are you suggesting that?
I just was thinking about how that.
So grievance is one form of an injustice claim. So there's no shortage of different formulations of an injustice claim.
But you're seeing that as a broader category.
Absolutely, broader, Now, the theories of injustice often focus on institutions, legal justice and so on, procedural, distributive and so on. And if I may say, philosophers have some claim on giving analytical theories about the nature of justice. But the irony is that the experience of injustice is really quite different from the experience of justice. That is, you think conceptually, well, what injustice just must be the lack of just something just, okay? But the problem is, as experienced and as lived by these communities, the sense of injustice is so strong and so compelling and so clear, as it were. It's real. It's real from the episodes, the grievances, the history, the injustices, as it were, the inequities. Whereas the sense of justice is shallow, it's ethereal, it's kind of flubby, or it's kind of like a blob. That is, there's not, without experience of injustice, there is little clear sense of what a just world would be. That the injustice is the dominant experience. So there's an asymmetry. So I'm just going to mention a couple things about injustice, and I'm going to postpone or leave power, for another time, or defer to others. So there's an asymmetry in the experience of justice and injustice. Again, to understand injustice is such a riveting, defining experience in contrast to a sense of justice. So this is clear in a couple of, or certain ways in which injustice is experienced. So injustice, I want to just talk about the sense of injustice and what is that sense. First of all, it's much more than conceptual. It's much, much more than conceptual. First of all, it's emotional. The sense of injustice is experienced as righteous indignation, dishonor. It's experienced as sometimes a revulsion, as denial of a people, as humiliation, as shame. So these are the moral emotions that are very commonly associated with the sense of injustice. And I suspect in the language that you hear about disenfranchised groups, there is almost always this dishonor, indignity, and humiliation. That's a part of this. The second aspect here is, of course, language, names and frames, which I'll just say, names and frames. So the stories of the injustice, Julie, the stories of grievances by disenfranchised groups, they're endless stories. And some conflicts even have the radius. Of course, the famous media broadcast in the prelude to the Rwandan genocide obviously have a venue for constant stories of the injustices that the Hutus were experiencing. So the stories are really very gripping, and invariably they come out with the frame that the outgroup, so there's a frame of going from the outgroup deeds. I'm going to erase this up here. If I erase it, I'll just erase this. So the outgroup deeds basically tell us a lot about their malicious character. So the stories basically often go from their deeds to their essential nature. They are fundamentally, inherently depraved, or obsessed with conquest, or so on. So this is the framing of famous framing of outgroup vice, and leading to the implication of in-group virtue. Okay, so the outgroup vice invariably implies, sometimes the in-group virtue isn't repeated in every story because, as I say, the obsession with the enemy evil is just so overwhelming. But the in-group vices are suppressed. The in-group vices are forgotten. As a victim, the victim narratives basically always accentuate the vulnerability and therefore virtues of the in-group. The third aspect here of the sense of injustice is a kind of vision, I see, vision and images. That injustice is a double vision. I'm going to say it's a double vision. So think of, maybe some of you have felt that you've seen or experienced an injustice, or some unfairness or inequity. Actually, to be alive, it pretty much has to happen. It's invariable. And I think if we consider what is that experience like, it's a double vision of what is really happening and what could or should happen. So it's a vision of what exists, as it were, in the world, and a vision of the ideal possibility. So people used to always talk about that as the real and the ideal. And that may be a little too abstract, because I think this is very much experiential and a normal part of being indignant about some injustice. And I think we feel this all the time when we even hear on the news of a killing or some injustice that we take to be unfair. So this is a double vision of the real and the as it were, virtuous, or the real and the ideal, I'll just say very briefly. So with those three elements, that is a kind of model for an experience of injustice, which in turn is a very common aspect of contentious politics of identity and difference. It's the claim of injustice that involves emotions, it involves names, it involves a vision, and these claims obviously are very much a part of a lot of the cases that we see Now, there's a vision of Palestinians against the Israelis, the Israeli government, a vision of many indigenous groups, not just in Venezuela, about their demands, the Irish in Northern Ireland, and so on. All have, I think, in their stories, these elements of injustice, which underpin the identity politics. So just to conclude, these processes are very common in the politics of identity and difference. Legitimation is very much part of it, and we'll see whether it applies in the chapters that you're considering. So,
I'm
yes.
wondering, where will you put the losses of either property or human beings? Because most of the time when you lose something on someone, your narrative and your emotions are also going to change and be adjusted by that specific loss. So where will you put that in those
Sure.
three?
So you mean the loss of a family member?
Yeah, or even property in general.
Sure, that fits perfectly. So there's so many different examples of the injustice. So that's clearly an injustice. So when we talk about groups seeking recognition and so on, underlying that is a sense of an unjust killing, an unjust theft, or clearly an immoral practice. And so in other words, contentious politics is much more than power dynamics. It is the judgment that the high power group is abusing their power in a way that violates some rights. So I think that's one of many examples where that fits.
Thank you, Dan.
Okay.